What if the person you trusted most in the world asked you to make the ultimate sacrifice? Not for love, not for money, but to free them from a burden they could no longer carry. What if that person was your father, and that burden was your mother? On a quiet summer evening in upstate New York, a college honor student made a choice that would shatter 3 families forever. She picked up her car keys, drove across town, and helped orchestrate the murder of the woman who gave her life. But this wasn't a crime of passion. This was manipulation so calculated, so twisted, that it took investigators months to uncover the truth. What started as a bitter divorce quickly transformed into psychological warfare, and at the center of it all was a 19-year-old girl named Sarah, caught between a father's threats and a mother's love. The question isn't whether Sarah committed a crime. The question is, was she a killer, or was she the victim all along? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Stay with me until the end of this story, because what happened next will challenge everything you think you know about family loyalty. And I want you to ask yourself one question as we go through this. What would you have done? Sarah Martinez grew up in what looked like the perfect American family. Her mother, Linda, was a devoted elementary school teacher who spent her evenings grading papers and her weekends at Sarah's soccer games. Her father, Robert, seemed like the ideal husband and provider, at least on the surface. But behind closed doors, their marriage was cracking under the weight of Robert's controlling behavior and explosive temper. When Sarah was 16, Linda finally found the courage to file for divorce. She'd discovered Robert's gambling problem, his secret debts, and the lies he'd been telling about their finances for years. What should have been a clean break turned into a nightmare that would last for 3 years. Robert fought the divorce proceedings at every turn, claiming Linda was an unfit mother, demanding custody of their youngest daughter, Emma, and refusing to pay the court-ordered child support that was draining his military salary. Sarah found herself caught in the middle of a war zone. Her father would call her constantly, pouring his heart out about how unfair the system was, how your mother is destroying our family, how he couldn't afford to keep paying these ridiculous support payments. During these late-night phone calls, Robert would paint himself as the victim, a dedicated military man being taken advantage of by his vindictive ex-wife and a corrupt legal system. But Sarah was no ordinary teenager. She was a Dean's List student at Rochester Institute of Technology, studying engineering, with dreams of changing the world. She was logical, methodical, and desperate to fix her broken family. Her father knew exactly how to exploit these qualities. He would present their family problems like engineering challenges that needed solving. He'd say things like, "Sarah, you're the smart one in this family. You can see the bigger picture, right? Your mother is bleeding me dry. I'm going to lose everything, including you girls." The manipulation was subtle at first. Robert would share financial documents with Sarah, showing her how much money he was paying in alimony and child support. He'd calculated it down to the penny, $43,000 a year. "That's more than most people make," he would tell her. "Your mother doesn't need all that money. She's being greedy. She's trying to destroy me because she can't control me anymore." Sarah began to see her mother differently. Where she once saw a hard-working single mom trying to provide for 2 daughters, she now saw someone taking advantage of her father's generosity. When Linda would ask Sarah about her father's calls, Sarah would lie, saying they barely talked about the divorce. The secret conversations became a bond between father and daughter, a bond that Linda didn't even know existed. By the summer of 2017, the psychological manipulation had been going on for nearly 2 years. Robert had been stationed in New Jersey with the military, but his divorce case kept dragging on in New York courts. He was paying lawyers, paying support, paying alimony, and, according to him, slowly going bankrupt. That's when the tone of his calls to Sarah changed from frustrated to desperate. "I can't keep living like this," he would tell her. "Your mother has all the power. The courts always side with the mother. I'm never going to be free of this debt. I'm never going to be able to move on with my life. I'm trapped, Sarah, and there's only one way out." Sarah would ask what he meant, but Robert would just sigh and say, "Maybe you're better off without me. Maybe everyone would be better off if I just wasn't here anymore." The suicide threat started small, a comment here and there about how worthless he felt, how he couldn't see a way forward. But they escalated quickly. Soon Robert was calling Sarah multiple times a week, sometimes in tears, talking about how he'd researched different methods, how he'd written letters to his daughters explaining why he had to leave them. The psychological pressure on 19-year-old Sarah was immense. She was carrying a 3.8 GPA while working part-time to help pay for college. She was planning for her future, dating a fellow engineering student, living the normal life of a college sophomore. But several times a week, she would get calls from her father threatening to end his life, and she would spend hours talking him down from the ledge. She felt responsible for keeping him alive. That's when Robert presented her with what he called the only solution. It was August of 2017, just a few weeks before Sarah's junior year was set to begin. Robert called her, sounding more composed than he had in months. He told Sarah he'd been thinking about their situation, really thinking, and he'd realized there was a way to solve everything. A way for him to be free of the financial burden, a way for the family to be together again, a way for Sarah to have her father back. But it required Sarah to make a choice that would test her loyalty as a daughter and challenge everything she thought she knew about right and wrong. Robert explained that Linda was the source of all their problems. Without Linda in the picture, there would be no more support payments, no more legal battles, no more family being torn apart. And most importantly, Robert wouldn't have to kill himself. "Sarah," he said, his voice steady and matter-of-fact, "you can either help me solve this problem, or you can attend my funeral next week. Those are your only two options. I can't live like this anymore. But if you help me, we can be a family again. You, me, and Emma. No more courts, no more fighting, no more debt. Just us." The ultimatum was clear, but the method was still unclear. Sarah, trained to think logically, asked the questions any engineer would ask. What exactly are you proposing? How would it work? What are the risks? Robert had answers for everything. He'd been planning this for months, maybe longer. He knew Linda's schedule, her routines, her vulnerabilities. He knew that she would be alone on the evening of August 28th, because Emma would be staying at a friend's house. Sarah's mind raced through the implications. If she said no, her father would kill himself, and she would have to live with the guilt forever. Emma would grow up without a father because Sarah was too weak to help when he needed her most. But if she said yes, if she helped with this plan, then Linda would be gone, and Sarah would have to live with that guilt instead. Robert gave her time to think about it. He didn't pressure her for an immediate answer. That was part of the manipulation too, making her feel like this was her choice, her decision, her solution to the family's problems. Over the next few days, Sarah found herself actually considering it. She looked at her mother with new eyes, calculating whether Linda's life was worth more than Robert's life. It was a horrible equation, but Sarah had been trained to solve equations. On August 25th, 3 days before it happened, Sarah called her father back. Her voice was quiet, almost robotic, as she spoke the words that would change everything. "Okay, Dad, I'll help you, but we have to be smart about it. We have to make sure we don't get caught." Robert's relief was audible through the phone. He told Sarah how proud he was of her, how she was saving the family, how she was the best daughter a father could ask for. If you're still watching at this point, type "I'm still here" in the comments. Let's see the real ones who don't skip. The plan that Robert and Sarah developed was methodical, calculated, and chillingly thorough. Robert had been thinking about this for months, maybe even years. He knew that Linda's death had to look like suicide. That was the only way they could be sure the authorities wouldn't investigate too deeply, the only way Robert could claim custody of Emma and move on with his life. Sarah's role was crucial. She would be the one with alibis, the grieving daughter who discovered her mother's body. More importantly, she would be the one who could manipulate the scene to support their story. Robert had studied Linda's habits obsessively during their marriage and throughout their divorce proceedings. He knew she worked late on Mondays, grading papers in her home office. He knew she usually sent Emma to sleepovers on Monday nights so she could focus on her lesson plans. He knew the layout of the house they had once shared, and he knew exactly how to make Linda's death look self-inflicted. But there was one problem. Robert was stationed in New Jersey, and Linda lived in Bath, New York. The distance was too far for Robert to travel alone without creating a suspicious timeline. That's where Sarah came in. She had a car, she had access to Linda's house, and most importantly, she had a relationship with her younger sister Emma that would provide the perfect cover story. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. On the evening of August 28th, Sarah would drive to her father's base in New Jersey and pick him up. They would drive back to Bath together, arriving at Linda's house around 9 p.m., when they knew Linda would be home alone, working in her office. Sarah would knock on the door, using the excuse that she needed to pick up some textbooks she had left behind after her last visit. While Linda was distracted by Sarah's presence, Robert would enter through the back door that he still had a key to from their marriage. Robert would overpower Linda in her office, strangle her with a rope he had purchased specifically for this purpose, and then stage the scene to look like suicide. Sarah's job was to keep Emma distracted if she happened to be home, and to be Robert's alibi for the time of death. They would drive back to New Jersey together, and Robert would be back on base by midnight. Sarah would drive home to Rochester, and the next morning she would call Linda's house acting worried that her mother wasn't answering her phone. For 3 days, Sarah lived with the knowledge of what they were planning to do. She attended her classes at RIT, studied for her upcoming exams, and had dinner with her roommates. But every few hours her phone would buzz with a text from Robert, confirming details of their plan. The murder weapon had been purchased. The timeline had been finalized. The story had been rehearsed. All that remained was the execution. On the morning of August 28th, Sarah woke up knowing that by the end of the day her mother would be dead. She got dressed, ate breakfast with her roommates, and attended her morning classes like any other day. But that afternoon, she packed an overnight bag and told her friends she was going to visit family. In a way, she was telling the truth. The drive from Rochester to Robert's base in New Jersey took Sarah about 4 hours. During the drive, she called her father twice to confirm he was ready. Robert sounded calm, almost cheerful. He thanked Sarah repeatedly for being brave, for being loyal, for choosing family over everything else. He promised her that after tonight, their lives would be completely different. No more court dates, no more support payments, no more stress. Just the 3 of them. Robert, Sarah, and Emma, finally able to be a real family again. When Sarah arrived at the base, Robert was waiting for her in the parking lot with a small duffel bag. He got into her car and immediately began reviewing the plan one final time. They had a 4-hour drive back to Bath, and Robert used every minute of it to reinforce Sarah's role and prepare her for what was about to happen. He reminded her that this was the only way to save his life, the only way to keep the family together, the only choice that made logical sense. But as they got closer to Bath, Sarah began to have second thoughts. The reality of what they were about to do was starting to sink in. This wasn't a theoretical problem anymore. This wasn't one of her engineering projects where she could calculate risks and benefits on paper. This was her mother's life. Linda had never been anything but loving toward Sarah. She had worked extra hours to help pay for Sarah's college tuition. She had driven 6 hours to Rochester just to bring Sarah homemade cookies during finals week. Sarah started to voice her doubts, but Robert was ready for this too. He reminded her of the phone calls, the threats, the promise he had made. "Sarah," he said, his voice taking on a harder edge, "I've already bought the rope. I've already made peace with God. If we turn around now, I'll use that rope on myself instead of your mother. Is that what you want? Do you want Emma to find my body in the morning instead of Linda's?" The emotional manipulation was complete, Sarah had been presented with a false choice: either be complicit in her mother's murder or be responsible for her father's suicide. There was no third option in Robert's scenario, no possibility of family therapy or bankruptcy or simply walking away from the financial obligations. In Robert's world, someone had to die tonight, and Sarah had to choose who. They arrived at Linda's house at 9:15 p.m., 15 minutes later than planned. Sarah parked her car 2 blocks away in case any neighbors might recognize it. Robert had changed clothes during the drive, putting on dark jeans and a black hoodie. He looked more like a burglar than a father about to commit the ultimate betrayal. Before they approached the house, Robert made Sarah repeat the plan one more time. She would knock on the front door and ask Linda if she could come in to get some textbooks. She would keep Linda talking for at least 5 minutes while Robert entered through the back door. When Sarah heard sounds of a struggle from Linda's office, she would leave immediately and wait in the car. Robert would stage the scene and meet her outside within 15 minutes. Sarah's hands were shaking as she walked up to her mother's front door. Through the window, she could see Linda sitting at her desk, grading papers just like Robert had predicted. Linda looked so peaceful, so focused, so alive. For a moment, Sarah considered running away, calling the police, screaming to warn her mother. But then she thought about Robert's threats, about Emma growing up without a father, about the promises that this was the only way to fix everything. She knocked on the door. Linda answered with a smile, surprised to see her oldest daughter but happy for the unexpected visit. "Sarah, what are you doing here? Is everything okay?" Sarah forced herself to smile back and explained that she needed to grab some textbooks she had forgotten in her old bedroom. Linda welcomed her in, offering to make coffee, asking about Sarah's classes, being the loving mother she had always been. As they walked toward Sarah's old bedroom, Sarah could see Robert's silhouette moving through the backyard. He was inside the house now, moving quietly toward Linda's office. Sarah tried to keep her mother talking, asking about Emma's school year, discussing Linda's lesson plans, desperately trying to act normal while her heart pounded in her chest. That's when they heard the sound. Not a scream, not a crash, but something worse. The sound of Linda's chair falling over in her office. Linda's head turned toward the noise, confusion crossing her face. "What was that?" she asked Sarah. "Did you hear something?" Sarah had a choice in that moment. She could warn her mother, she could scream for help, she could tackle Robert and stop what was happening. But instead, she said the words that would haunt her forever. "I didn't hear anything, Mom. Maybe it was just the cat." Linda smiled and nodded, turning back toward Sarah's bedroom to help her find the textbooks that didn't exist. That's when Robert appeared in the hallway behind them, moving silently like a predator stalking his prey. Linda turned around and saw her ex-husband, the man she had divorced, the man who had been threatening her for years, standing in her hallway holding a rope. "Robert?" Linda's voice was confused, not yet afraid. "What are you doing here? How did you get in?" Robert didn't answer. He just moved toward her with the rope stretched between his hands. That's when Linda understood. Her eyes went wide, not with fear, but with heartbreak, as she looked at Sarah. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Sarah, what have you done?" Those were Linda Martinez's last words. What would you have done if you were Sarah in that moment? Would you have tried to stop your father, or would you have chosen his life over your mother's? Comment below and tell me what you're thinking right now, because what happened next changed everything. Robert strangled Linda in the hallway of her own home while her daughter watched. It took less than 2 minutes. When it was over, Robert carried Linda's body to her office and staged the scene to look like suicide. He positioned the rope around a light fixture, placed a chair beneath Linda's feet, and even wrote a fake suicide note on Linda's computer, using phrases he had copied from her old emails. Sarah waited in the car while Robert cleaned up the scene. When he finally emerged from the house 23 minutes later, his first words to his daughter were, "It's over. We're free now. Everything is going to be better." But Sarah wasn't thinking about freedom. She was thinking about the look in her mother's eyes when she realized her own daughter had betrayed her. They drove back to New Jersey in silence. Robert tried to make conversation, talking about how they would need to act surprised when Linda's body was discovered, how they would need to comfort Emma during the funeral, how they could finally be a family again. But Sarah wasn't listening. She was replaying those final moments over and over in her mind, wondering if there had been another way, wondering if she had just helped murder the only person who had ever loved her unconditionally. The next morning, Sarah drove back to Rochester and waited for the phone call that would change everything. On August 29, 2017, at 10:23 a.m., a concerned neighbor called 911 to report that Linda Martinez hadn't picked up her morning newspaper and wasn't answering her door. The neighbor had seen Linda's car in the driveway and her lights on all night, but there was no movement in the house. When police arrived and entered through an unlocked window, they found Linda's body hanging from a rope in her home office with what appeared to be a suicide note on her computer screen. The initial investigation seemed straightforward. Linda Martinez, a 46-year-old divorced elementary school teacher, had apparently taken her own life during a bitter custody battle with her ex-husband. The suicide note mentioned financial stress, loneliness, and feeling like a burden to her daughters. Everything appeared consistent with a tragic but clear-cut case of suicide, except for one small detail that caught the attention of Police Chief Jeff Spaulding. There was a rope burn on Linda's chin, not around her neck, where you would expect to find it in a hanging, but on her chin. It was a small mark, barely visible, but it suggested that the rope had been positioned differently during Linda's final moments. Chief Spaulding had investigated dozens of suicides during his career, and he had never seen a rope burn in that location. It was unsettling. The first phase of the investigation focused on Linda's mental state in the weeks leading up to her death. Detectives interviewed her friends, her co-workers at the elementary school, and her family members. What they found didn't match the suicide note at all. Linda had been making plans for the future. She had signed up Emma for fall soccer league just 3 days before her death. She had scheduled a parent-teacher conference for the following week. She had even made dinner reservations for her birthday the following month. More importantly, Linda's friends described her as hopeful about the future, not despondent. Yes, the divorce had been difficult, but Linda felt like she was finally moving forward with her life. She had been talking about dating again, maybe traveling during summer breaks, pursuing her master's degree in education. These weren't the conversations of someone planning to end their life. The investigation expanded to include Linda's family members, starting with her daughters. Emma, the 14-year-old, was clearly devastated by her mother's death and couldn't provide much useful information. But Sarah's interview raised some red flags. She seemed oddly composed for someone who had just lost her mother. When detectives asked about Linda's state of mind, Sarah mentioned financial stress and depression that others hadn't observed. When asked about her own whereabouts on the night of August 28th, Sarah said she had been in her dorm room at RIT studying. But Sarah had made a critical error. She had forgotten about the security cameras. RIT's parking system used automated license plate readers to track when students entered and exited campus. The system showed that Sarah's car had left campus at 1:47 p.m. on August 28th and didn't return until 8:23 a.m. on August 29th. Sarah had been gone for almost 19 hours, not studying in her dorm room as she had claimed. When confronted with this evidence, Sarah initially stuck to her story, claiming the cameras must be wrong. But the detectives had more than just parking records. Cell phone tower data showed that Sarah's phone had pinged towers in New Jersey around 6 p.m. on August 28th, and then pinged towers near Bath, New York around 9 p.m. Her phone had remained in the Bath area until after midnight, then moved back toward New Jersey before finally returning to Rochester. The electronic evidence was overwhelming, but Sarah continued to deny any involvement in her mother's death. That's when investigators decided to look more closely at Robert Martinez. They discovered that he had requested a day pass from his military base on August 28th, claiming he needed to handle personal business in New York. His commanding officer confirmed that Robert had seemed stressed lately, talking frequently about his divorce and financial problems. When detectives interviewed Robert, he admitted to being in New York on the night of Linda's death, but claimed he had been visiting friends and had never gone to Linda's house. However, his alibi fell apart quickly. The friends he claimed to have visited said they hadn't seen Robert in months. Gas station surveillance footage showed Robert's vehicle at a station just 10 miles from Linda's house at 8:47 p.m. on August 28th. But the most damaging evidence came from Robert himself. During his interview, he made several statements that revealed inside knowledge of the crime scene. He mentioned details about the positioning of Linda's body and the contents of the suicide note that had not been released to the public. When detectives pointed out these inconsistencies, Robert's carefully constructed story began to collapse. 3 weeks after Linda's death, both Robert and Sarah Martinez were arrested and charged with murder. The evidence against them was substantial. Electronic records proving they were together on the night of the murder, inconsistencies in their alibis, and Robert's intimate knowledge of crime scene details. But perhaps the most compelling evidence was the psychological profile that emerged during the investigation. Forensic psychologists who interviewed Sarah described a young woman who had been systematically manipulated by her father for years. Robert had used Sarah's intelligence against her, presenting their family's problems as logical puzzles that required extreme solutions. He had isolated Sarah from her mother by sharing inappropriate details about their divorce and financial situation. Most cruelly, he had threatened suicide to force Sarah into compliance, knowing that she would feel responsible for his death if she refused to help. The case went to trial in March of 2018, and the proceedings revealed the full extent of Robert's manipulation. Text messages between father and daughter showed how Robert had groomed Sarah over several months, gradually escalating from complaints about Linda to suggestions that she was the source of all their problems. Phone records showed that Robert had called Sarah dozens of times in the weeks leading up to the murder, often late at night, when Sarah would be most vulnerable to emotional manipulation. During Sarah's testimony, she broke down completely as she described the impossible choice her father had given her. "He said he was going to kill himself if I didn't help him," she sobbed on the witness stand. "He said Emma would grow up without a father because I was too selfish to save him. I thought I was saving my dad's life. I thought if I helped him this one time, our family could finally be together again." Robert's testimony painted a different picture. He claimed that Sarah had initiated the plan to kill Linda, that she had been the one consumed with hatred toward her mother. He portrayed himself as a grieving father who had been manipulated by his own daughter, but the evidence contradicted his claims at every turn. The manipulation had clearly flowed in one direction, from father to daughter. The psychological evaluation of Sarah revealed the classic signs of long-term emotional abuse. She had been conditioned to prioritize her father's needs over her own moral compass. She had been taught to see Linda as an enemy rather than a loving mother. Most tragically, she had been convinced that murder was not just acceptable, but necessary to save her family. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. Robert Martinez was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge called his manipulation of his daughter one of the most heinous acts of psychological abuse he had ever encountered. Sarah's case was more complex. Her defense team argued that she had been a victim of her father's manipulation, essentially brainwashed into participating in a crime she never would have considered on her own. The prosecution countered that regardless of the manipulation, Sarah was an intelligent adult who had made a conscious choice to help murder her mother. In December of 2018, Sarah Martinez pleaded guilty to second-degree manslaughter and was sentenced to 1 to 3 years in state prison. The judge acknowledged the manipulation she had endured, but emphasized that she had still participated in the murder of an innocent woman. "Your mother loved you unconditionally," the judge told Sarah during sentencing. "She worked extra hours to pay for your education, she supported your dreams, and she trusted you completely. In her final moments, she saw that trust betrayed by the person she loved most in the world." Sarah served 13 months in prison before being released on parole in February of 2020. She was required to undergo psychological counseling and was prohibited from contacting her younger sister Emma, who had been placed in the care of Linda's parents. The judge felt that Emma, who had lost her mother and watched her father and sister go to prison, needed to be protected from further trauma. The ripple effects of Linda Martinez's murder extended far beyond the immediate family. Emma, who was just 14 when she lost her mother, struggled with depression and trust issues. She had nightmares about the night her mother died, wondering if she could have prevented it somehow. Linda's parents, who had gained custody of Emma, dealt with their own grief while trying to help their granddaughter heal from the trauma. The elementary school where Linda taught held a memorial service that was attended by hundreds of students, parents, and fellow teachers. Colleagues described Linda as a dedicated educator who stayed late to help struggling students and spent her own money on classroom supplies. She had been planning a summer reading program for underprivileged children at the time of her death, a program that never happened because the person who should have protected her had betrayed her instead. This wasn't just the story of a murder. This was the story of how manipulation can turn love into a weapon, how psychological abuse can convince someone to betray their deepest values, and how the bonds that should protect us can become the chains that destroy us. Sarah Martinez wasn't born a killer. She was a Dean's List student with a bright future who loved her mother deeply. But over the course of 2 years, her father systematically destroyed her ability to think clearly about right and wrong. He used her intelligence, her loyalty, and her love for her family to turn her into an accomplice in the most unthinkable crime. The question that haunted the courtroom, and should haunt all of us, is this: where does victimization end and responsibility begin? Sarah was clearly manipulated, clearly abused, clearly groomed to participate in this crime. But she was also an adult who made a conscious choice to help murder an innocent woman. Can someone be both victim and perpetrator at the same time? Robert Martinez destroyed 3 lives the night he killed Linda. He murdered his ex-wife, he ruined his oldest daughter's future, and he traumatized his youngest daughter beyond repair. His manipulation was so complete, so calculated, that Sarah didn't fully understand what she had done until it was too late to take it back. But perhaps the most tragic part of this story is that it was completely unnecessary. Robert could have declared bankruptcy. He could have moved to a different state. He could have simply walked away from his financial obligations and started over. Instead, he chose murder, and he convinced his daughter that murder was the only logical solution to their problems. Linda Martinez was 46 years old when she died. She was a beloved teacher, a devoted mother, and a woman who was finally building a new life after escaping an abusive marriage. She deserved to see her daughters graduate from college, to walk them down the aisle at their weddings, to hold her grandchildren in her arms. All of that was stolen from her by the 2 people she loved most in the world. Sarah Martinez was released from prison after serving just over a year, but her real sentence will last the rest of her life. She will never be able to forget the look in her mother's eyes when Linda realized what was happening. She will never be able to rebuild her relationship with her sister Emma, and she will never be able to answer the question that will haunt her forever. What if she had chosen differently? So, I ask you now, what do you think? Was Sarah Martinez a victim of her father's manipulation, or was she a willing participant in her mother's murder? Could you have resisted the kind of psychological pressure that Robert applied, or would you have made the same choice that Sarah made? And most importantly, how do we protect vulnerable people from the kind of manipulation that turns family love into a weapon of destruction? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Was she a victim, an accomplice, or both? What would you have done in her situation? And don't forget to subscribe for more true crime stories that will make you question everything you think you know about human nature. Because at the end of the day, this story teaches us that the people closest to us, the ones we trust most completely, might also be the ones capable of causing the greatest harm. And sometimes the most dangerous prison isn't made of bars and walls. Sometimes it's made of love, loyalty, and the manipulation of someone who knows exactly which emotional buttons to press. The truth is, we're all capable of being manipulated under the right circumstances. The question is, will we recognize it before it's too late?